So I'm going to read To Kill a Mockingbird, which is on the top 10 most banned books of all time. And I chose a chapter. I was thinking about choosing the court scene, which is very heated, but I decided to choose another scene which depicts another theme in the book, which was one of the reasons it was banned, which is about morphine addiction. When we were small, Jen and I confined our activities to the southern neighborhood, but when I was well into the second grade at school and tormenting Boo Radley became passé, the business section of Macomb drew us frequently up the street past the real property of Mrs. Henry Lafayette Dubose. It was impossible to go to town without passing her house unless we wished to walk a mile out of the way. Previous minor encounters with her left me no desire for more, but Jem said I had to grow up sometime. Mrs. Dubose lived alone except for a Negro girl in constant attendance, 2 doors up the street from us in a house with steep front steps and a dog-trot hall. She was very old. She spent most of each day in bed and the rest of it in a wheelchair. It was rumored that she kept a CSA pistol concealed among her numerous shawls and wraps. Jem and I hated her. If she was on the porch when we passed, we would be raked by her wrathful gaze, subjected to ruthless interrogation regarding our behavior, and given a melancholy prediction on what we would amount to when we grew up, which was always nothing. We had long ago given up the idea of walking past her house on the opposite side of the street. That only made her raise her voice and let the whole neighborhood in on it. We could do nothing to please her. If I said, as sunnily as I could, "Hey, Mrs. Dubose," I would receive for an answer, "Don't you say hey to me, you ugly girl. You say good afternoon, Mrs. Dubose." She was vicious. Once she heard Jem refer to our father as Atticus, and her reaction was apoplectic. Besides being the sassiest, most disrespectful mutts who ever passed her way, we were told that it was quite a pity our father had not remarried after our mother's death. A lovelier lady than our mother never lived, she said, and it was heartbreaking the way Atticus Finch let her children run wild. I did not remember our mother, but Jem did. He would tell me about her sometimes, and he went livid when Mrs. Dubose shot us this message. Jem, having survived Boo Radley, a mad dog, and other terrors, had concluded that it was cowardly to stop at Miss Rachel's front steps and wait, and had decreed that we must run as far as the post office corner each evening to meet Atticus coming from work. Countless evenings, Atticus would find Jem furious at something Mrs. Dubose had said when we went by. "Easy does it, son," Atticus would say. "She's an old lady, and she's ill. You just hold your head high and be a gentleman. Whatever she says to you, it's your job not to let her make you mad." Jem would say she must not be very sick, she hollered so. When the 3 of us came to her house, Atticus would sweep off his hat, wave gallantly to her, and say, "Good evening, Mrs. Dubose. You look like a picture this evening." I never heard Atticus say like a picture of what. He would tell her the courthouse news and would say he hoped with all his heart she'd have a good day tomorrow. He would return his hat to his head, swing me to his shoulders in her very presence, and we would go home in the twilight. It was times like these when I thought my father, who hated guns and had never been to any wars, was the bravest man who ever lived. The day after Jem's 12th birthday, his money was burning up his pockets, so we headed for town in the early afternoon. Jem thought he had enough to buy a miniature steam engine for himself and a twirling baton for me. I had long had my eye on that baton. It was a V.J. Elmore's. It was bedecked with sequins and tinsel. It cost 17 cents. It was then my burning ambition to grow up and twirl the Macomb County High School band. Having developed my talent to where I could throw up a stick and almost catch it coming down, I had caused Calpurnia to deny me entrance to the house every time she saw me with a stick in my hand. I felt that I could overcome this defect with a real baton, and I thought it generous of Jem to buy one for me. Mrs. Dubose was stationed on her porch when we went by. "Where are you 2 going at this time of day?" she shouted. "Playing hooky, I suppose. I'll just call up the principal and tell him." She put her hands on the wheels of her chair and executed a perfect right face. "Aw, it's Saturday, Mrs. DeBose," said Jem. "Makes no difference if it's Saturday," she said obscurely. "I wonder if your father knows where you are." "Mrs. DeBose, we've been going to town by ourselves since we were this high." Jem placed his hand palm down about 2 feet above the sidewalk. "Don't you lie to me," she yelled. "Jeremy Finch, Maudie Atkinson told me you broke down her scuppernong arbor this morning. She's going to tell your father, and then you'll wish you never saw the light of day. If you aren't sent to the reform school before next week, my name's not DeBose." Jem, who hadn't been near Miss Maudie's scuppernong arbor since last summer, and who knew Miss Maudie wouldn't tell Atticus if he had, issued a general denial. "Don't you contradict me," Mrs. DeBose bawled. "And you," she pointed an arthritic finger at me, "what are you doing in those overalls? You should be in a dress and camisole, young lady. You'll grow up waiting on tables if somebody doesn't change your ways." "A Finch waiting on tables at the OK Cafe. Ha!" I was terrified. The OK Cafe was a dim organization on the north side of the square. I grabbed Jem's hand, but he shook me loose. "Come on, Scout," he whispered. "Don't pay any attention to her. Just hold your head high and be a gentleman." But Mrs. DeBose held us. Not only a Finch waiting on tables, but one in the courthouse lawing for niggers. Jem stiffened. Mrs. DeBose's shot had gone home, and she knew it. "Yes, indeed. What has this world come to when a Finch goes against his raising? I'll tell you." She put her hand to her mouth. When she drew it away, it trailed a long silver thread of saliva. "Your father's no better than the niggers and trash he works for." Jem was scarlet. I pulled at his sleeve, and we were followed up the sidewalk by a philippic on our family's moral degeneration, the major premise of which was that half the Finches were in the asylum anyway, but if our mother were living, we would not have come to such a state. I wasn't sure what Jem resented most, but I took umbrage at Mrs. DeBose's assessment of the family's mental hygiene. I had become almost accustomed to hearing insults aimed at Atticus, but this was the first one coming from an adult. Except for her remarks about Atticus, Mrs. DeBose's attack was only routine. There was a hint of summer in the air. In the shadows it was cool. But the sun was warm, which meant good times coming. No school and dill. Jem bought his steam engine, and we went by Elmore's for my baton. Jem took no pleasure in his acquisition. He jammed it in his pocket and walked silently beside me toward home. On the way home, I nearly hit Mr. Link Deese, who said, "Look out now, Scout," when I missed a toss, and when we approached Mrs. DeBose's house, my baton was grimy from having picked it out of the dirt so many times. She was not on the porch. In later years, I sometimes wondered exactly what made Jem do it. What made him break the bonds of, "You just be a gentleman, son," and the phase of self-conscious rectitude he had recently entered. Jem had probably stood as much guff about Atticus lawing for niggers as I, and I took it for granted that he kept his temper. He had a natural, tranquil disposition and a slow fuse. At the time, however, I thought the only explanation for what he did was that for a few minutes he simply went mad. What Jem did was something I'd do as a matter of course had I not been under Atticus's interdict, which I assumed included not fighting horrible old ladies. We had just come up to her gate when Jem snatched my baton and ran flailing wildly up the steps into Mrs. DeBose's front yard, forgetting everything Atticus had said, forgetting that she packed a pistol under her shawls, forgetting if Mrs. DeBose missed, her girl Jessie probably wouldn't. He did not begin to calm down until he had cut the tops off every camellia bush Mrs. DeBose owned, until the ground was littered with green buds and leaves. He bent my baton against his knee, snapped it in two, and threw it down. By that time, I was shrieking. Jem yanked my hair, said he didn't care, he'd do it again if he got a chance, and if I didn't shut up, he'd pull every hair out of my head. I didn't shut up, and he kicked me. I lost my balance and fell on my face. Jem picked me up roughly, but looked like he was sorry. There was nothing to say. We did not choose to meet Atticus coming home that evening. We skulked around the kitchen until Calpurnia threw us out. By some voodoo system, Calpurnia seemed to know all about it. She was a less than satisfactory source of palliation, but she did give Jim a hot biscuit and butter, which he tore in half and shared with me. It tasted like cotton. We went to the living room. I picked up a football magazine, found a picture of Dixie Howell, showed it to Jem, and said, "This looks like you." That was the nicest thing I could think to say to him, but it was no help. He sat by the windows, hunched down in a rocking chair, scowling, waiting. Daylight faded. 2 geological ages later, we heard the soles of Atticus's shoes scrape the front steps. The screen door slammed. There was a pause. Atticus was at the hat rack in the hall, and we heard him call, "Jem!" His voice was like the winter wind. Atticus switched on the ceiling light in the living room and found us there frozen still. He carried my baton in one hand. Its filthy yellow tassel trailed on the rug. He held out his other hand. It contained fat camellia buds. "Jem," he said, "are you responsible for this?" "Yes, sir." "Why'd you do it?" Jem said softly, "She said you lawed for niggers and trash." "You did this because she said that?" Jem's lips moved, but his "yes, sir" was inaudible. "Son, I have no doubt that you've been annoyed by your contemporaries about me lawing for niggers, as you say. But to do something like this to a sick old lady is inexcusable. I strongly advise you to go down and have a talk with Mrs. DeBose," said Atticus. "Come straight home afterward." Jem did not move. "Go on," I said. I followed Jem out of the living room. "Come back here," Atticus said to me, and I came back. Atticus picked up the Mobile press and sat down in the rocking chair Jem had vacated. For the life of me, I did not understand how he could sit there in cold blood and read a newspaper when his only son stood an excellent chance of being murdered with a Confederate Army relic. Of course, Jem antagonized me sometimes until I could kill him, but when it came down to it, he was all I had. Atticus did not seem to realize this, or if he did, he didn't care. I hated him for that, but when you are in trouble, you become easily tired. Soon I was hiding in his lap, and his arms were around me. "You're mighty big to be rocked," he said. "You don't care what happens to him," I said. "You just send him on to get shot at when all he was doing was standing up for you." Atticus pushed my head under his chin. "It's not time to worry yet," he said. "I never thought Jem would be the one to lose his head over this. Thought I'd have more trouble with you." I said I didn't see why we had to keep our heads anyway, that nobody I knew at school had to keep his head about anything. "Scout," said Atticus, "when summer comes, you'll have to keep your head about far worse things. It's not fair for you and Jem, I know that, but sometimes we have to make the best of things, and the way we conduct ourselves when the chips are down, well, all I can say is when you and Jem are grown, maybe you'll look back on this with some compassion and some feeling that I didn't let you down. This case, Tom Robinson's case, is something that goes to the essence of a man's conscience. Scout, I couldn't go to church and worship God if I didn't try to help that man." "Atticus, you must be wrong." "How's that?" "Well, most folks seem to think they're right and you're wrong." "They're certainly entitled to think that, and they're entitled to full respect for their opinions," said Atticus. "But before I can live with other folks, I've got to live with myself. The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience."